Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And so, as ever, to the front pages, the Sunday Telegraph has a Brexit story there about the SNP potentially derailing trade deals and the England rugby team having been derailed very effectively, not by the SNP, but by Scotland yesterday. I never watch these games because whenever I do, Scotland loses. So I didn't watch it and Scotland won. QED. Sunday Times there has a story about Philip Green of Topshop. And also the Archbishop of Canterbury warning of xenophobia and self-pity after Brexit, and a lot about that cabinet meeting inside. There's the Mail on Sunday. They've got a story about their Helplines for Heroes, Helplines for Soldiers campaign. They've been running for a long time, and they seem to have got a breakthrough on that. And again, more of the politics inside. All sorts of things to talk about. Where's the Observer? I'm going to get the Observer. Here we go. The Observer has a whole lot of senior Labour figures, Neil Kinnock and many more, piling pressure on Jeremy Corbyn. They want him to commit to joining the single market as well as staying in the single market as well as the customs union. We'll be talking about much more of that before. Let's start, however, Katie Perrier. You were at the heart of the May operation for a long time, and we see the May operation in this big spread in the Sunday Times. There's the library scene I was talking about at the beginning of the programme, all the ministers gathered round, and a very detailed briefing from Number 10 in that paper.
Oh, good morning, Andrew. Yes, it's a cracking long read by Tim Shipman in the Sunday Times, but it goes in great detail about what happened during the day. They moved from room to room in a Cluedo-style scenery. They left their mobile phones and had them taken away, so they discussed Brexit and many other things over shortbread and cups of tea. And surprisingly, it felt that it seems to be they got on. It's a brilliant piece of briefing from Number 10 because great pictures of who's who in the room. And some very good comments
here. I mean, there is a fairly detailed account of what they have now agreed. Can we just go through that?
Absolutely. So they've talked about a demand for mutual recognition, standards on goods traded between UK and the EU. They talked about a public commitment to make sure those standards are the same, as high as the EU. A pledge to keep rules and regulations substantially similar, but also there's some read-through here about what Greg Clark has done. He stood up for the automotive sector, saying that divergence doesn't protect these jobs. So a real kind of a run-through of everybody's role in the day.
Is it fair to say that the essence of the deal is we all start off in the same place, but over time Britain will be able to diverge in all sorts of different ways, and there'll be some kind of agreement or mechanism not involving the European Court which will oversee that? That's the essence of the deal. Absolutely,
but of course the EU told us we couldn't cherry-pick, that we couldn't pick what we wanted.
So will it be sellable?
Exactly. So the EU may well turn around and say, well, that's what your starting position is, but we don't like it very much. And of course, we need a meaningful vote in Parliament at some point. So it's whether or not the rest of the parliamentarians think that this is good enough.
So we're all scrabbling around trying to understand the changes. Big changes as well, June, on the Labour side, the Observer story there.
Indeed, and you mentioned it briefly just a moment ago. So front page of the Observer, the Labour alliance piles pressure on Corbyn over Brexit stance. So what's happened is 80 senior Labour figures have come together to put pressure on Jeremy Corbyn, not just to back remaining in some form of customs union, but also to remain in the single market.
June, can I just stop you there? Because, again, people get confused about these things. But the customs union is, as it were, the great ring fence around the entire EU. And if we stay inside that or something like it, then we have to take EU rules. And the EU negotiates for us.
Totally.
Therefore, many people, including Neil Kinnock and others, are saying, well, if we're going to do that, if we're going to take the EU rules for that, why not just stay in the single market as well?
Totally, which is about the movement of goods. And obviously, we do have to look at the four freedoms, but what we'll have to decide is whether or not it's worth it once we know the terms of the deal. And what these 80 senior Labour figures are saying, like you said, Neil Kinnock, Helena Kennedy, Doreen Lawrence, Chukwuemeka, what they're saying is that if Jeremy Corbyn wants to fund his anti-austerity measures, that the only way to do it is to remain in the single market.
Yes, and of course this is highly political because there is a motion down to an amendment to the trade bill backed by Anna Soubry and Tory Remainers.
Rebels,
and the question is if the Labour Party gets alongside that, then Theresa May can potentially lose her majority on the absolutely crucial question of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, they've pushed those votes back into the other end of the spring, but the Select Committee chairman are turning around and saying, well, we might have a vote earlier. And so they're all getting together. So this is looking like it won't go away.
No.
You can't kick this down the road forever, because we have the actual negotiations at the end of this, and it has to be done by then.
But a brilliant quote in the Sunday Times basically talks about how she's carrying on spinning those plates. It's a very difficult job, and the more you kick that down the road, hopefully we will be in a better place. We will have some concessions from the EU, and maybe we might win some people around.
Wait and see. Katie, the other really, really important story today is the horror going on again in Syria. We thought things had calmed down, and they have got much, much worse over the last 2 weeks.
They have. We have this ceasefire agreed by the UN. Russia doesn't look like to have vetoed it, so it looks like it will go ahead. But of course, whenever there is some kind of ceasefire, there is heavy bombing beforehand, which shows that they try and get as much done before they have to abide by this ceasefire. It's shocking scenes, and we've been here before. And at what point do we feel that we can intervene, or that something else can be done? Parliamentarians feel helpless. We feel helpless, and we can't even think, well, we just give our money to the aid charities, because we're not quite sure that's going to end up in the way that we thought we could donate to in the first place.
Absolutely. But this is the penalty, as it were, of deciding not to intervene at the beginning. We intervened in Iraq, and to many people's views, that went horribly wrong. So this time we don't intervene, and the penalty we pay is standing on as horrified and completely impotent observers.
And as Johnny Mercer says, the Conservative MP, at least force yourself to watch these pictures, because if you can't do anything about it, at least don't turn a blind eye to what's going on.
And also, they can't be sure that Assad will keep to it either, so that's the other
June,
thing.
we've been talking a lot about ghastly scandals in the aid sector, and there's yet another one this morning in the Sunday Times or in the Telegraph.
This one is in the Sunday Times, and yep, there's another one, the Mines Advisory Group. This is the anti-landmines charity that Princess Diana famously backed. They've been hit with terrible stories that many of their senior employees used prostitutes. And then there are 2 stories in the DRC where members actually had affairs with local women, and one apparently impregnated one of the women and abandoned her. And this is a charity that Prince Harry supports. So these stories are not going anywhere.
They're not going anywhere. They're spreading in all directions.
Yeah.
Katie, let's turn to another of the really big stories of the moment we haven't talked about, is the university and college strike, because this is unprecedented. And, of course, students are in a completely new position now because they're consumers.
They are consumers. They're paying £9,250 a year for their fees, and not just that, many more in terms of living costs, and they're demanding a higher standard of return on their investment than they may have demanded before. So what we're seeing is that there's no let-up in the fact that these lecturers are going to continue to strike, and they're striking over pensions. They're going to lose something like £10,000 a year under the new rules.
And we should say a lot of these are people whose pensions wouldn't have been that big in the first place. So this is a really big chunk of their pensions, and they're suddenly not asked or negotiated with. They're just told you're losing all this money.
And of course, you know, all the attention is on vice-chancellors who are on big salaries, but this covers all lecturers across all universities, and many are on much lower wages. And what we've seen is the students are actually quite big numbers supporting the lecturers on this, but at the same time saying, well, if we're not going to have our lectures, we want a refund for our money.
OK, well, let's keep moving on. There's so much to talk about today. June, Stormzy kicked up a storm at the Brits.
He did.
And Theresa May came back to him.
It's a new day in politics when the Prime Minister is having to respond to a grime artist. Isn't it great? So, of course, he called her out over Grenfell in his Brits performance. But then, the next day, backed a petition to have it debated in the Commons, and the petition overnight received over 137,000 signatures. It's even more than that now. And I think it's wonderful to see somebody like him using his platform for a purpose and speaking truth to power.
It's good, but at the same time, Theresa May was not responsible for Grenfell, and all of a sudden people lay
she's responsible for dealing with it.
And she's committed to dealing with that, in fact.
And that's why it's right that these young people are holding her to account.
I think you'll find that they're on the same page.
Katie, let me ask you the new world of Number 10 these days. Back in the day, an MP put down a question and eventually the Prime Minister would be obliged to respond. Now Stormzy says something on the Brits and the Prime Minister has to respond.
But it's not just Stormzy. Actually, the Prime Minister is doing a lot more of that open government than maybe it was there when I was there. And I appreciate that, and I think that's the way forward. Lots of MPs are saying it's much more of an open door now. You can go in and you can have those discussions.
Do you think your successor would have to go through and knock on the door and say, excuse me, Prime Minister, let me tell you about somebody called Stormzy?
There's always those scenarios. Even if you see something on Twitter and you have to describe to politicians exactly who they are in the first place.
Is she a big grime fan?
I doubt it very much, but Matt Hancock apparently is, so there you go.
All right, let's move on. There's an extraordinary story about Winston Churchill in the Telegraph. Now, the one thing we all knew about Winston Churchill was that he never played away.
Yes, but it seems that is not the case. I mean, Churchy, who knew it? Apparently, he had an affair with a lady called Lady Castleross, who is Cara Delevingne's great aunt. And apparently they had an affair for almost 8 years, and he painted sensuous portraits of her.
And
Who
every
knew?
single paper has this. And for those who are interested in the Churchill story,
about it.
this is genuinely new. This is something none of us knew about before.
Yeah.
OK, finally. A very sad story, I think we're going to have to end on here, which is Alice, this extraordinary actress who we all kind of remember. We remember her very, very compelling and unusual face in Vicar of Dibley and many, many other things. I think for weddings and a funeral she was there too. Absolutely.
Emma Chambers died at such a young age, in 53. And many celebrities have come out today saying that she kind of lit up the screens, and she was very much someone that was warm and generous and kind. I think that she'll be really missed within that community. But we can always watch reruns, and I always think that it's either a really sad thing to lose someone, but the gift that keeps on giving to watch them on the screen still is such a nice
so unexpected and so shocking. She always had that gorgeous kind of goofy look. She kind of represented the goofy in all of us.
Well, the role was made for her, actually.
Absolutely.
And she played it to full extent, so much missed.
Much missed. R.I.P. Thank you both very much indeed.
So there they all were, the least aligned ministers in history, meeting for tea at the Prime Minister's country manor to try to decide what the Brexit that only some of them love actually means. Now, allies of him and him both claimed victory for their respective heroes, which doesn't really make sense since the Foreign Secretary wants Britain to take back control and the Chancellor wants maximum cheap access to the EU's giant marketplace. Now, if they really think we can have both, chances are they also believe in the Tooth Fairy. Now, in the end, the Prime Minister signed them up to a trade plan described as managed divergence. But managed divergence surely better describes the strained unity in the Cabinet itself. So there's a truce in this battle, Allegra Screeney. But do you think it'll really hold?
I like what you did there, Robert. Certainly the Prime Minister thinks it will hold. Sunday Express have a line from her speech coming up saying she's going to tell us all that the Brexit days are ahead of us. Now, something does seem to have flipped recently, whereas she used to have support for Brexit from the opposition, but not from her Cabinet. They were at each other's throats. Now the Cabinet appears united behind her. Have a look at this beautiful picture the Mail Online have run inside their paper. Gorgeous drawing room at Chequers, and you can see the happy Cabinet family. Some poor snapper had to get up on a very high ladder for that picture. But nonetheless, these guys are united behind her. Now it is Labour going in for the kill. Look at this tweet this morning. It's from Kevin Schofield of what Keir Starmer's just said this morning, confirming Labour wants to stay in the customs union. It's something Emily Thornberry, Shadow Foreign Secretary, told us last week. Now, they look like they're going to back a critical, very important cross-party amendment, and we're going to talk you through why this could be so incredibly difficult for the Prime Minister. This line here is the working majority, and you can see Theresa May is just about nestled with her number of MPs above it, but of course it's very finely balanced. And then this is how the Customs Union Amendment could shake down. You've got Lib Dems backing it, opposing her. You've got the SNP, these yellow squares, backing it, opposing her. Now we expect Labour backing it, opposing her. And then the really, really critical bit. Move across at least 5 Tory MPs to oppose her. It starts to get really difficult. Of course, some Brexiteer Labour MPs might come over, like Kate Hoey. We don't know if they will, but they might. But you can see, as soon as she starts to peel, well, start 1, 2, 3, go over to this side and join people like our friend over there, Nicky Morgan, it starts to get incredibly dangerous for her. It could be terminal, and if she does lose it, it may well lead to a confidence vote and possibly a general election. I wonder how on earth our friend Nicky feels about this.
Well, guess what? I'm going to ask Nicky Morgan about this very question. I mean, your name is down on New Clause 5, this amendment to the trade bill, which would force the government to keep as an option joining a customs union. Do you have any sense of whether senior ministers have now moved enough in your direction with what they want out of a trade bill for you to drop your support for New Clause 5?
Not yet. I mean, I think, obviously, important discussions were held at Chequers on Thursday. The Prime Minister is going to make a speech on Friday, we believe, which is going to set out their sort of guidelines before they start negotiating with the EU. And I think that the briefing from Number 10 to Papers yesterday said that by the time we've heard the speech, we won't need the amendment anymore. So that's obviously going to be a good thing. We will wait and see. But I think
But you've not had any private assurances about the detail?
Not yet. No, not yet. I mean, obviously, the discussions only finished late on Thursday. But just to be very clear, the amendment is absolutely consistent with the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech, where she left open options relating to customs. She said we could be an associate member of the customs union. There's to become kind of other arrangement. And so I think this is important. It'll be very interesting to hear what Nigel Dodd says a bit later on, because I think that Irish border issue is the reason that many of us feel so strongly about this.
Absolutely. Chris, the Labour Party is in the process. The NEC's decided, Jeremy Corbyn will formally announce this tomorrow, that you're in favour of membership of a customs union. Can you see, would you be happy to vote with Nicky for her clause that would effectively force the government into that position?
Well, I mean, there's nothing new about our position in relation to the customs union. I mean, we included it in our manifesto that we needed to retain the benefits of
the benefits, but you are now saying something slightly different, which is you want to negotiate membership.
But we've been saying that for
union.
some time as well, though, haven't we, Robert? I mean,
sure, people have said it on this show, but when the leader stands up and says it formally tomorrow, it feels like you don't think it's a big moment when he stands up and says it tomorrow.
Well, it's always a big moment when Jeremy gets up and speaks, obviously, but yeah, I mean, I guess that you know, the media like to make it a big moment, and it maybe will be a further clarification of our position. But
just to be clear, are you happy voting with Nicky to force the government in this?
Well, listen, I mean, obviously that will be something that you know the usual channels will look at, you know, the whips and the party leadership, and we'll come to a view. But what we need to make sure that we get to a position, I think, is that we have a customs union at the end of this process for a whole range of reasons, both economically, but also in relation to, the Good Friday Agreement. We've got to, I think, you know, protect that, and one of the key pillars of that, it seems to me, is ensuring that we don't have a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland.
I mean, one of the problems with, for example, the existing customs union with Turkey is that Turkey doesn't benefit from third-party trade deals with the likes of South Korea and has no voice when it comes to setting the EU's trade policy. Presumably Labour wouldn't be in favour of that kind of arrangement.
Well, obviously we will get into the process of negotiating a position which is in the interests of the United Kingdom. Listen, we're obviously a much bigger economy than Turkey is, the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world.
Nicky, do you think we could do better than Turkey?
To negotiate.
I'm sure we can do better than Turkey, but Turkey is a model. Turkey are not members of the European Union. Being part of a customs union arrangement, whatever we want to call it, is perfectly possible, which means that we don't have to have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but also allows what Turkey is able to do is to negotiate free trade agreements in relation to many other different areas, but there are some areas where they've agreed they're going to be part. So agricultural goods might be, for example, you know, a part of that, which is something that's going to work for the Irish issue. So there's lots of discussion to have. Look, it's perfectly legitimate for Parliament to have its say on something that is so important. That's what this is about. And you're right, there may be many weeks before we get to any kind of vote where government, ministers, backbenchers are able to discuss it.
Now, Allegra, I think you've got a couple of words for us.
A few more than a couple, I'm afraid, Robert. This week, over 2 million of you on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram viewed this from Chris Williamson's boss, Jeremy Corbyn. This was his challenge to newspaper bosses. He says, in his own words, change is coming. As you can see, Twitter, 1 million viewers, nearly 1 million on Facebook. His argument is that the newspapers won't be so powerful in future. The question is he right? Now it's time for... It's Geek of the Week. OK, not one geeks, but 5 geeks. 5 professors at Loughborough University crunched newspaper coverage of different parties during the snap election last year. And you can see, you don't need any explanation, Labour's in red, and boy, oh boy, it was incredibly negative throughout the campaign. Week 3 appears to be a little less negative than all the others, but a really, really brutal onslaught from the newspapers onto the Labour Party. Now, while Corbyn didn't win the general election, he did do, you have to admit, he did do better than expected. expected. So it suggests that this onslaught didn't necessarily have that much of an effect. Now, looking over here, data from the Reuters Institute that studies journalism, they have shown, in terms of sources of news for us all, over the last 2013 to 16, number of people who get their news from print going down, and then that yellow line at the bottom, social media going up. So suggest that Jeremy Corbyn has a point, except a lot of these social media shares are sharing newspaper pieces, or they are reacting to an agenda set by the newspapers. So all in, Jeremy Corbyn is probably right that social media is getting more and more powerful, but it is not all conquering yet.
I mean, it is quite striking, isn't it, that, you know, you had this press attack on Jeremy Corbyn for meeting a Czech diplomat a few times. Doesn't seem to have moved the popularity dial on Corbyn at all. It's sort of... And the thing about media these days is, you know, people appear to be in silos. So, broadly, the Daily Mail is telling people who are already sympathetic to the Daily Mail's point of view that, you know, there are reasons not to like Jeremy Corbyn. But does anybody else actually care?
I think you're right to say, it was interesting, when I go and speak to schools and sixth forms, I often ask people where they're getting their news from. And, of course, it's not newspapers. It is online. It's interesting what Allegra was saying there about the sharing of newspaper coverage. A big quick plug. Hooray for research from Loughborough University, which I have the pleasure of representing in Parliament. But interesting, there's a very interesting article by Fraser Nelson, Spectator, this week, which talks about the fact that we as a party have got to stop talking about the past and talking about, you know, past histories and past friendships, you like, and talk about the future, and that's really, really important, and I think we've all got to think about how we do that.
And so do you think your colleagues like Ben Bradley, or Ben Wallace indeed, who sort of picked up on the sort of Mail and Sun attacks on, you know, Corbyn for meeting the Czech, do you think they were just misguided? They should have just ignored it?
I don't think they should have ignored it. I think it's perfectly legitimate to point out that the Leader of the Opposition has been keeping company with some unsavoury people. Ben was completely right to apologise, and he's got, obviously, to pay the damages and everything else, and we move on. But I do think, actually, we saw that in the election. Lots to talk about.
Do you think these attacks on Jeremy are good or bad for your party?
Well, I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, it seems they've actually been quite positive, because our poll ratings have increased. But it was an out-and-out smear, wasn't it, at the end of the day? And if we're talking about keeping unsavoury company, I mean, that is a pretty low blow, if you ask me. I mean, Willie Whitelaw was meeting with the IRA secretly, for example, when he was deputy to
No, but he was trying
Margaret
to
Thatcher.
negotiate a peace.
Well, what do you think, Jeremy? Jeremy...
I certainly don't know.
We don't know, because Jeremy won't tell us.
Let's take a look at what's leading this Sunday papers, shall we? Starting with The Observer, it says over 80 senior Labour figures will urge Jeremy Corbyn to go further and back remaining in the single market. That's ahead of a speech tomorrow where he's expected to support a customs union with the European Union. The Sunday Telegraph says that ministers want to prevent the SNP from gaining control of key trading powers after Brexit, which they say could make it difficult for the new government, for the government to forge new trade deals. The Sunday Express also leading on a Brexit story, saying the PM will head to Brussels this week to lay out the government's plans. And the Mail on Sunday reports on that new round-the-clock helpline for British troops in need of support. Well, joining me to discuss all that, the journalist and author Rachel Shabby, MEP, formerly of UKIP, Stephen Wolfe,
Thank you.
and ex-Conservative advisor Giles Kerring. Very good morning to all of you. I have to say, the one story that my producer refused to put into this morning, bolt from the blue. I'll let you into a little secret. The reason they won yesterday, a certain Stuart Paterson, who's the physio for Scotland, who managed to get them done. So, yeah, I'm sharing in the victory, a very personal connection to it. But let's get into the papers proper, shall we? Page 10 of the Sunday Times. We're getting an idea now, aren't we, of what exactly the agreement is within the Conservative Party. We're not quite there yet.
No, we're not quite there yet, and it's really quite concerning. Because from the European Parliament's perspective now, we're in a very critical period. I would call it mission-critical period, and that is because from now until October, they have to make the fundamental decisions of how they're going to present the papers to the EU27. They're going to have to take them around the Council and also go beyond that. They have to go into some of the regions to explain what the deal is that they're agreeing with. And, of course, once you've got Barnier's team in the Commission, he's got to explain it to a number of MEPs, led by Verhofstadt and Weber from the EPP, who are going to be antagonistic to much of what we're reading in this paper today. And I think the key 4 points that you get that we're from this is the suggestion here on the kind of second paragraph that there's a demand for mutual recognition, make a public commitment to British standards remaining as high as the EU, have the rules substantially similar. And, of course, the EU aren't going to want to agree to all of that because for them it's really important not to have a competitor that's successful on the other side of the channel.
If the EU doesn't agree to this, and it seems likely given what we've heard this week, I mean, all that she has is, you know, the victory of getting cabinet agreement on something.
Well, it's almost like a sense of false harmony because the cabinet doesn't matter in this parliament so much. It's all about where the backbenchers are. And I don't think the backbenchers are going to agree to this. You know, you've had a lot of stories around in the papers today about what's going to happen regarding a vote on the customs union. And I think she's going to lose that. And that's going to be potentially a key turning point for her. Does this become a question of confidence? Does this become a question of an existential crisis within the Conservative Party? Where do they go? So, yes, that's great. Really good colour in this piece, but somewhat irrelevant in terms of where the backbenchers are.
I mean, just looking at Rachel at front of the Observer, I mean, we saw Jeremy Corbyn making a speech to the EEF at the beginning of the week in which he mentioned a customs union, made it pretty clear. And just at the point that he's putting the finishing touches to tomorrow's speech, you've got 80-odd figures, senior figures, a lot of them, piling on pressure over single market membership.
Yeah, as they have been doing on the front page of the Observer for some time now. But I think that you know, there are people in the 48% who will find the Labour Party's approach too slow, like glacial. And I can understand that because nobody likes the uncertainty that we're in. But I also think there's something to recommend the Labour Party's current strategy, which seems to me rather like very gently and slowly and delicately prizing the fingers away from somebody clutching a grenade, which is the grenade of the hard fundamentalist Brexit, for which there is no constituency, not in Parliament and not in the population. And I think this Labour position of very, very slowly, we can see over the past 18 months, you know, getting a transition period on the table, getting a parliamentary vote on the table. All of this is with the help of course, others across party. Conservatives have been involved in this as well. And it now looks like they will be achieving something very similar over the customs union, again, for which there is no constituency, not in Parliament and not in the population. Nobody wants the Brexit that you are advocating.
You are talking about some sort of hard Brexit. There is only one Brexit. Brexit means Brexit, and that's very clear.
That's just words. That doesn't mean anything.
What it means is taking control of your borders, taking control of the ability to free trade.
You've got empty slogans. You've got nothing.
These absolutely mean fundamental things. They have to have your government be able to take control of all the decision-making. And when you say out of the single market, Osborne said it, the Prime Minister said it, Chuka Umunna said it on television. I was on numerous debates. Everybody in the country knew it meant leaving the single market and customs union because that's the only way we can take control of trade.
You don't have to be a hard Brexiteer per se to say that you want the ability to sign free trade agreements once you come out of the European Union.
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there's absolutely no constituency for the kind of free market fundamentalist race to the bottom, you know, Brexit these, the hard Brexiteers, the fundamentalists, the ideologues.
The ideologues are the ones who want to ignore the 52% of people.
There is no support for that, and at some point you're going to have to engage with that reality.
People want. So just to bring in Giles here, can we at least agree that after Jeremy Corbyn's speech tomorrow, there may well be a majority in the House of Commons for the softer end of the Brexit spectrum?
Completely. I think this is the week which in the stakes rise. We've heard this before, but really we are in game time. You know, people don't realise in October we're going to have to make a decision. I think, you know, you've got Corbyn moving towards a customs union, and this is all about putting pressure on May, and you may see an existential crisis for the Conservatives. You know, the whips may turn it into a vote of confidence within her. She's going to lay out where she's going to go on Friday, but I think, yes, it is a problem for them. It's a problem.
Let's see if we can find some accord around the table this morning. Ben Bradley, he's a bit of an idiot, isn't he?
Well, I'll let Rachel go on this one.
He was forced to apologise for the libellous claims he made about Jeremy Corbyn. A very, very grovelling apology is now on Twitter from Ben Bradley. He also has to donate to a homeless and a food bank charity in his constituency of Mansfield, which I think is the cherry on top of this. But it does raise questions about the Conservatives, doesn't it? I mean, they really piled into this kind of botched smear operation that some of the newspapers were running all last week, unsubstantiated claims about Corbyn based on one discredited source. You know, this apology comes 1 month after May said that she was setting up a unit to tackle fake news and to tackle the lies on social media. Well, how about she deals with the lies on social media perpetuated by her own government and her own cabinet?
I'd say two things on this. Ben Bradley was right to apologise. You know, there's no argument there. But there are wider questions here about why did Corbyn meet Czech spies at the height of the Cold War, where there was a whole geopolitical crisis going on. And look, let's look at this, right? Ben Bradley apologised. We've had Labour politicians like John McDonnell repeating claims for Esther McVeigh to be lynched. We've had the hard left calling for physical violence. And there's a wider issue here. Ben Bradley fronted this up. Labour haven't. So, look, I think that's a question Labour need to answer. And actually, Jeremy Corbyn should get in front of a TV camera and answer the questions about why does he meet this Czech guy.
This is exactly how a smear operation works.
No, it's not a smear operation. He needs to be held to account. Why can't he be held to account?
This is how it works. You say something that is
putting him on TV, hold him to account. He met. It's not a smear operation.
Ooh, but why doesn't he answer?
But it's not a smear that he met.
That's exactly how you run a smear operation.
What is substantial?
Surely you don't have to think that Jeremy Corbyn was a Czech spy to think that, do you know what? At a time when Charter 77 was in effect, when the Czechs were locking up dissidents left, right and centre, it is appropriate to say, why were you holding those meetings? I completely concede the way in which this story has been reported by some aspects of the press has gone entirely in the wrong direction. And frankly, people at CCHQ must have been absolutely banging their heads against the wall that Ben Bradley was making comments like that.
There's no argument with him apologising, but let's hold him to account.
But about that
do a TV interview then. Do a TV interview.
In the 80s.
Go in front of, come on a great channel like Sky News and do a TV interview.
Stephen, I tried.
Yeah, no, this is a sort of banter, but whatever you say, Rachel, you can't get away from the fact that the people of Britain are looking at Jeremy Corbyn and asking themselves fundamental questions. You met with the IRA and in some ways believe that he supported them at a time that we were at war with a terrorist organisation. You have backed the leaders of Venezuela, which has run that country into the ground. And here we now have information where you were talking with people of the communist side, and I don't know what he said. And I'm going to be very careful, so you're not going to quote me as being a Ben Bradley too on this. But the people are asking serious questions of why do you look as though you never support Britain? You look for helping other countries first. And that is his major challenge. And he wants to be leader of the United Kingdom. He can't stay in the customs union and the single market because he looked as though he's backing the EU as well. Back Britain first, Corbyn. Don't back other countries.
OK, last chance to try and get some accord round the table. Giles, the story about the charity championed by the Diana, Princess of Wales, they've now been drawn into this.
Yeah, so a landmine charity championed by the Princess of Wales has said that some of its staff were regularly paying women for sex. This comes off the back of a report in the Sunday Telegraph today saying that Water Aid and Action Aid had issues around sexual harassment. So clearly, look, this story's got some way to run. There are huge issues around governance, huge issues around accountability within the charities, and it does feel like for some time they felt like they're above the law, and now they need to be held to account. I think tomorrow, Penny Mordaunt is calling for all the charities to report back about what they're doing around safeguarding vulnerable people and children.
Guys, do you know what? I'm very sorry, but we are actually going to have to leave it there. Probably for the best, maybe. Lovely to see you all. Thanks for popping in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, next month, Theresa May will begin formal negotiations with her European counterparts on what the future EU-UK relationship should look like. This week, she'll lay out her vision of life after Brexit, and she'll declare that our best days really do lie ahead of us. EU leaders, though, beg to differ and have already taken some preemptive swipes. While the talk's likely to get tough in Brussels, the key battles could be played out closer to home. It's known as the Brexit War Committee, but the smiles suggested an outbreak of peace among the Cabinet's big beasts. For now, at least. They'd arrived at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat, on Thursday afternoon to try and agree a common position for the next round of Brexit talks. 8 hours later, ministers were apparently still smiling, having agreed on something called ambitious managed divergence in future trade with the EU, One of those present said the Prime Minister had played a blinder, but will it be enough to hold the whole party together? Earlier in the week, a letter from the pro-Brexit European Reform Group found its way into the newspapers, politely reminding the Prime Minister that when we leave, nothing but full regulatory autonomy will be good enough. But it's Remain-minded Tories who could throw a real spanner in the works. Conservative MP Anna Soubry announced on Thursday she had tabled a new amendment to the trade bill to force the government to form a customs union with the EU. 27 other EU countries also need to be won over. Brexit Secretary David Davis was in Vienna on Tuesday, colourfully describing what Brexit will not look like.
They fear that Brexit could lead to an Anglo-Saxon race to the bottom, with Britain plunged into a Mad Max-style world borrowed from dystopian fiction. These fears about a race to the bottom are based on nothing.
But the EU are not convinced. European Council President Donald Tusk arguing that the UK was still trying to cherry-pick its future relationship with the EU.
I'm afraid that the UK position today is based on pure illusion.
Until now, Jeremy Corbyn has played his Brexit cards close to his chest. He may begin to reveal his hand in a major speech tomorrow. And this week, he unusually raised Brexit at Prime Minister's questions.
This government isn't on the road to Brexit, Mr. Speaker. It's on the road to nowhere.
Can I congratulate the right honourable gentleman? Because normally he stands up every week and asks me to sign a blank cheque. And I know he likes cheques, but really, that is terribly...
That was a reference to reports that the Labour leader had held meetings with a former Czechoslovakian spy in the 1980s. Mr Corbyn hit back at those reports with a social media video in which he said, rather cryptically, change is coming to the newspaper industry.
Publishing these ridiculous smears that have been refuted by Czech officials shows just how worried the media bosses are by the prospect of a Labour government. They're right to be.
Tory MP Ben Bradley had to apologise to Mr Corbyn over a tweet about the allegations, saying, "I accept that I caused distress and upset to Jeremy Corbyn by my untrue and false allegations suggesting he had betrayed his country by collaborating with foreign spies." But it wasn't all Brexit and brush passes. The Prime Minister began the week announcing a review into higher education.
We now have one of the most expensive systems of university tuition in the world.
Theresa May wants to demonstrate her government isn't simply defined by Brexit, but navigating the complications of leaving the EU is an all-consuming task. If she can avoid it consuming her career, that could be her greatest achievement. Well, Ian, Kate and Steve were all watching that with me. Let's chew over some of what's been happening this week. So we've got some people saying at that meeting in Chequers, the Prime Minister played a blinder and got the Cabinet all to agree, but outside the Cabinet, it looks as though she's kind of assaulted on all sides by pro-Brexit, pro-hard Brexit Tory MPs, pro-Remain Tory MPs, the EU. It's not as easy as all that, is it, Ian?
Well, it's never going to be easy for a Prime Minister who hasn't got a parliamentary majority, but she is very resilient. Whenever she's knocked down, she bounces back again. I think she's had actually quite a reasonable week this week, starting off on the front foot on student tuition fees, ending the week with the meeting at Chequers, which I think a lot of commentators thought was going to be a disaster, that they wouldn't actually agree on the way forward. Now, the proof of the pudding will be in what she says in the speech on Friday, because we've got Jeremy Corbyn on Monday, and effectively she's got to come up with a little bit, well, probably quite a lot more detail than she has done in the past. But I think they've got the basis for that now.
And Kate, we've talked a lot on this programme about the arguments within the Cabinet, but now it looks as though the focus is more on the wider Conservative Party, and you've got pro-Remain MPs like Anna Soubry putting down an amendment to the trade bill saying they want to stay in a customs union, letter from pro-Brexit MPs like Jacob Rees-Mogg saying they want to be able to have full regulatory divergence. Which of those groups is ascendant and likely to win the day?
Well, I think what's most interesting this week is going to be Jeremy Corbyn's speech on Monday, because, of course, that comes before Theresa May's speech on Friday, and that will help tip those two sides, as it were, and we'll really see what will happen on the customs union. So Jeremy Corbyn, I think, is likely to say that he wants to stay in a customs union, and that's likely to make those MPs on the Tory side, like Anna Soubry and Nicky Morgan, who want to back a customs union and want to push for that in the Commons, to feel like they're going to have a bit more control over that situation and maybe force Theresa May into a softer position on Friday. Now, whether that's likely or not, I think we're yet to see. But if Labour's shifting its customs union position that much, that gives those Tory MPs a lot more strength in the House of Commons, because, of course, the government's already pushed back a vote on the customs union because they are worried about what's going to happen.
And those pro-Remain Tories and the Labour Party, they really believe they've got the parliamentary arithmetic to force a defeat on the government over a customs union. Do you think they're right about that, Steve?
Well, certainly in theory, they are right. There are enough Conservative MPs, if all the opposition, or virtually all the opposition, vote for this amendment. The government faces a defeat with profound consequences. Now, we will not know probably until the moment when the vote takes place. It will be a moment of one of these great parliamentary dramas where there will be huge pressure on Tory MPs not to go along with this and say, look, you're in alliance with Jeremy Corbyn, etc. So we won't know until the vote. But in theory, they've got the numbers. And it would be a game changer if this amendment was carried.
Because this is fascinating. This means that the power has gone to the House of Parliament and has left Number 10 and the Cabinet. Hilary Benn has described this as a backbenches parliament because the government doesn't have a majority. Is that where the authority really lies now?
In some ways it is. I'm not sure I agree with Steve on the parliamentary arithmetic, because there will be some Labour MPs that vote with the Conservatives. You're going to be talking to one of them later, yeah. Frank Field, I imagine he would. John Mann, Graham Stringer, Kate Hoey, there are a group of them. And I wonder about the numbers on the Tory benches. There's a hardcore group of about 10 or a dozen that you think might well support Anna Soubry's amendment, but I don't really see it going much beyond that. But you're right, it'll be on a bit of a knife edge. But I mean, if it came to it and the government were defeated on this, I mean, then we are in uncharted waters, because the government could actually make it a vote of confidence. It would be unusual to do on an amendment to a bill, but it's possible to do. Or they could then call a vote of confidence, and that really would put Anna Soubry and all the others in a bit of a tricky position, because if they did vote against the government on a vote of confidence, they would have to be deselected.
I've been getting